So there is no greater legal norm in the world than the one against slavery. It is unlawful in every country in the world, and yet there are more people enslaved now than at any time in human history.
They are jobs that are poorly paid, they are often dangerous, they are insecure, and they are temporary. And so workers, migrants, people around the world, these jobs are not simply sort of really far away and in places that we don't touch. They're very close to us in some key ways. If you buy, as I imagine you mostly do, cell phones or computers or other consumer electronics, if you buy clothes from time to time, you have likely bought from brands whose factories employ workers who have supply chains and modern-day slavery. Malaysia and Taiwan and Saipan, Jordan, Mauritius, Madagascar, we found really serious labor violations, systemic abuse and harassment of women workers in particular, violence and suppression of trade union rights. So a serious 1/3 of the workers that we interviewed were in a condition of forced labor. 1/3 of the workers in electronics facilities in Malaysia were effectively slaves.
So protesting, violence, rioting, and a mob mentality have overtaken the United States, much of the time under the full support of government and or media. This mob mentality is considered unquestionable since it is derived from racism and even from America's past history of slavery. But what if I told you that all these people you see here protesting in the United States, rioting and looting, demanding justice, are all complete hypocrites and can be proven to be absolute supporters of slavery, even to the point that they give their money to fund slavery around the world today? What if this was an absolute fact which was impossible to refute, to where all those who are demanding the end to silence of racism and reparations from our government for slavery are all supporting slavery now?
He forgot that we have the right to seek redress from our government. And you know what's worse than making a Portlander mad?
What's that?
It's telling a Portlander what they can't do.
What if all these same angry people who are so confident that they're correct, that they can go and rip down statues of Andrew Jackson, who was a murderer of Native American people and black people, but what if those same people ripping down the statue are giving their money now to the same exact sort of slavery? And what if this is absolutely provable? Would these same people change their lives? Would they turn their energy and fight against the slavery that they are supporting, that exists in the world today?
Globally, modern-day slavery is the second largest criminal industry after narcotics trafficking, and it's the fastest growing crime on our planet today. And the data, while it's important to give scope to this issue, continues to remain imprecise because the crime is clandestine, even though its victims are hidden in plain sight. The most reliable, the most recent, and the most conservative data tells us that at any given time, there are at least 40 million people enslaved around our planet.
The Bible is always absolutely correct and absolute truth. And what does the Bible say? The Bible says that every person is a liar and God is truth. If a human speaks out of their own volition and will, they speak lies. And if a person speaks as a prophet where God speaks through them, they speak truth, and that's the only way they can speak truth. Every person you see here on your screen, protesters and the Black Lives Matter advocates, are liars and hypocrites. It is absolutely a fact. What is my reasoning for saying this? My argument is simple and it's absolutely irrefutable. And here's the argument as follows. Point number one, here in the United States, racism is still very present, and we've never fully recovered from slavery. This is the basis of the protesting and associated rioting and looting going on. This is, of course, very true, and we've all heard this at great length. However, the problem is here in point two, which is that it's safe to say that literally all of the protesters and, unfortunately, associated rioters and looters are in full support of slavery now, the slavery that exists in the world today. And not only are they in absolute support of this, they give their money to fund it.
And I sent her off this email, hey, I got this great idea, let's go starve on Nike's wages in Indonesia.
And so he's like,
What it's like for Nike factory workers to make this kind of money and live under these conditions. A 9x9 cement box, it was over 100 degrees, it's 100% humidity, a small window, certainly no air conditioning.
No furniture. You slept on a very thin mat on an uneven cement floor covered in shelf paper.
The streets outside of your home are lined by open sewers, and what that means, like in the rainy season, you would have all that feces just float up into the streets and into your house.
And every time that you go to the bathroom, it comes back out into the sewer for everybody else to see and smell.
You would have football-sized rats that would stampede over the ceiling at night and come up through the toilet and look for stuff to eat in the house, or the fist-sized cockroaches that would crawl over you at night. We would go to different workers' homes. You got like 4 women sleeping in like an 8x8 cement box, and all their possessions are in there, like everything in this small area.
The workers would have to share a bathroom with 5 to 10 other families. The workers would have to share living quarters, actually like a row of shacks with corrugated tin roofs. And when you're working up to 15 hours a day, 6 to 7 days a week, your 2-year-old child just doesn't see you. They don't get to see their children.
The kids can't even go to school. Bosses, the factory bosses some of them are just brutal, ruthless, hired muscle to keep workers in line.
This is literally a life and death issue. And this happens at all the factories.
Every worker that we talk to, there's struggled with this fear, this culture of fear that just permeates the air, that they want to tell you the truth and try and fight for their rights, but they also want their kids to have a father or a mother. They're dealing every day with the threat of losing their lives for doing this kind of work.
How is this any different from what we all learned in our history classes about slavery in the 1700s and 1800s? It seems completely indistinguishable. But how many of the protesters and rioters and looters that are so prominently displayed on the United States mass media the last month have paid for and are wearing Nike shoes? Probably quite a few. But what other products are made by slaves and paid for by United States consumers, such as protesters, rioters, and looters? And the answer is well known. These products are everywhere. The documentary we were just showing about Nike shoes also discusses how the other major shoe manufacturers carry out the same slave labor, and it permeates all sorts of industries.
All prisoners! Free all prisoners!
Of America's largest retailers are selling shrimp prepared in Thailand by slave labor, including children. The investigation released by the Associated Press found enslaved migrant workers and children ripping the heads, tails, shells, and guts off shrimp at processing factories. Investigators use U.S. Customs records to show the farmed shrimp made its way into the supply chains of major U.S. food stores and retailers such as Walmart, Whole Foods, and Target, along with restaurants such as Red Lobster, and Olive Garden.
Uzbekistan, a country in Central Asia, has a horrific tradition of cotton slavery. Ranking among the top of 2016's Global Slavery Index report, Uzbekistan has a deeply ingrained system of modern slavery. The government state of Uzbekistan owns most of its land, meaning farmers within the country don't own their own land and farms, but rather lease them from the government. This system allows for the government to impose cotton production quotas on its own people and publicly shames and punishes those who don't meet these quotas. The government has, in other words, created a monopoly on its cotton industry and benefits immensely off the back of its own citizens. As every annual harvest comes, civilians are recruited and forced to pick cotton to meet their quotas. This doesn't mean just farmers though. Teachers, doctors, and even children are taken from their schools and forced to work. They are slaves to their own country and are placed in camps with horrific work conditions, often without even having running water. Knowing this, over 70% of major retailers like Gap and Levi's have strict policies not to buy cotton sourced from Uzbekistan, and it would seem that other major clothing companies like Forever 21, H&M, Toys R Us, and Urban Outfitters would as well never source their material from Uzbekistan. However, all four companies have sourced cotton produced in the country. Much of the cotton from Uzbekistan ends up in countries like China and Bangladesh, making it extremely hard to identify where their cotton was harvested. Forever 21 is believed to continue to source a majority of their cotton from Uzbekistan even today, where again, children as young as just 8 to 9 years old are taken from schools and forced into labor. The Ivory Coast, an extremely poor region of West Africa, exports hundreds of thousands of tons of cocoa annually. In fact, nearly half of all the world's cocoa. People in this region, in desperate hopes of work, are told that there's opportunity for work if they are willing to travel. Crowds of men, women, and young children leave their villages and even leave their countries in pursuit of this work. But every year, thousands encounter a world of captive slavery. Traffickers sell these people to farmers for as little as just $20. They are now the farmers' property and are forced into cocoa plantations and used for hard labor. Once in this dark system of slavery, it is nearly impossible for them to escape. They experience horrible work conditions and are locked away in tiny huts after a hard day's work every evening, given just small tin cans to use as toilets. To counter disobedience, they are beaten relentlessly by their masters every morning and evening until they are left nearly unconscious. They are then forced to work and watched extremely closely. This is done until they are deemed to have accepted their fate as slaves. They are told that if they ever attempt to escape, they will be killed, and it is this instilled fear that keeps them obedient to their masters. As stated, nearly half of the world's cocoa comes from the Ivory Coast. Of the cocoa that comes from the Ivory Coast, it is estimated that up to 90% of plantations use some form of slavery. This is a shocking statistic, as it means that at least 2/5 of the world's cocoa is tainted by slavery. With falling prices of cocoa, more and more farmers are buying and using slaves. Companies like Hershey, Mars, Kraft, and Nestle have all been directly linked to slavery. In 2001, media sources revealed that Nestle had been using farms on the Ivory Coast in which 600,000 children had been kept in slave-like conditions. Shockingly though, Nestle kept on using these same farms right up until 2012, when a second major report revealed just what was going on. While the company has pledged to change their ways, it is unapparent if anything has truly been changed. In 2016, the Fair Labor Association reported that 70% of Nestle's farms were not trained on the fact that slavery was even illegal. Foxconn, a China-based company, has become very well known as a major manufacturer in Apple products. It is also known as a company with various stories of abuse and labor violations. Reports of horrible work conditions, cramped living, and forcing workers to work upwards of 100 hours a week began to leak out of the company years ago, causing global outrage, with customers demanding retailers using Foxconn to improve their conditions. The biggest of which was, of course, Apple. Apple claimed that they were doubling down on improving conditions for their workers, and while indeed some aspects have improved, reports from as recently as 2013 seem to indicate that there's much left to be improved. Foxconn has been known to punish its employees by forcing them to clean toilets, sweep grass lawns, and write confession letters that are shown publicly to other workers to shame them. Living conditions for these workers are extremely cramped, with upwards of 20 to 30 workers sharing tiny 3-bedroom flats, meaning that up to 10 employees at a time are cramped into just one small bedroom. These conditions lead to extreme depression for many workers who are left with choosing between extreme poverty back in the villages where they come from or being essentially used as slaves. This causes record numbers of employees committing suicide at Foxconn. To combat this, the company has installed netting to stop suicides. Along with this, many employees were made to sign agreements stating that their families were not allowed to sue Foxconn if they were ever to commit suicide. While countless companies have been caught using illegally sourced cotton that is then used in the production of their clothing, it isn't just the cotton material that is produced using slavery. The actual production of sewing and putting together the clothing itself is often traced to slavery as well. In 2000, a Senate subcommittee hearing revealed that numerous major companies like Target, Gap, JCPenney, Calvin Klein, and Abercrombie & Fitch, just to name a few, used sweatshop labor in Saipan.
Shameful violation of human rights on American soil, the U.S. territory of Saipan, an island in the Pacific. Allegations that some young Asian women have become virtual indentured servants on the island.
And as you can see in that very end of that clip and other clips throughout, these are stories that have made the U.S. news. There's simply no secret to this. This is extremely well known. I find it extremely hard to believe that the Black Lives Matter advocates and members aren't aware of this, and that all the politically active protesters, and perhaps even the rioters and looters, aren't aware of this also. So why is the protest movement today that's so concerned with slavery and racism turning their back on blatant racism and slavery that exists in full force in the world today? And there's so much information on this topic. I could have put hours and hours of information covering seemingly every aspect of our lives here as American consumers, including any Black Lives Matter advocate that's a consumer in America and any rioter and looter and protester that's a consumer here in America who are actively supporting and funding slavery, racism, and torture, just as if it was 1850 in the United States right now. Black Lives Matter advocates, very proud in their ways, are committing an atrocity by turning their back on this. Their silence is tyranny. Their silence is compliance to this slavery. So, as you can see, premise 3 here is self-evidently true. Black Lives Matter advocates and the protesters in the United States, along with the rioters and looters, are definitely supporters of worldwide slavery and even fund its existence. Therefore, we must conclude that despite all the fury and energy of the protesters and rioters and Black Lives Matter advocates, they are in fact complete hypocrites. The protesters that we see in the streets, along with the rioters and looters, and the Black Lives Matter advocates, are all using these products, all financing this slavery that exists in the world today. This is not a secret. This is extremely well known. So the question is, why is this movement so eager to ignore this slavery? Is this a movement of justice? Or is this just a movement about selfishness, bent on stealing out of stores, in fact stealing items that are made by slaves around the world? And will protesters just endlessly march and march, or will they in fact fight against these systems of slavery in the world? Or will they in fact turn away in silence, which they themselves said is a type of tyranny? In the end, this movement reveals its selfishness and its hate and anger for reasons given in this video. It's not a spiritual movement. is a movement about the wisdom of the world, which is in fact foolishness, and the whole history of the world proves that point. Only when the self is surrendered to God and God fully absorbs and permeates in fullness the self can the self act in love and a true revolution happen. And before that, and before a movement acts in love, which only comes from God, a political movement and a revolution can only exhibit hypocrisy, contradiction, and absurdity.